It's I thought I'd I thought I'd share with the group a little of my family history today, and uh, and let you know that I was I was raised by a man who survived both the Great Depression of the 30s and was shot a couple times in World War II. So that with an introduction. When I was growing up, if I didn't finish every single speck of crumbs on my plate, I was in big trouble. And so that's a cultural thing that my dad couldn't help. And when I asked him later in life, I said, Dad, with all the abundance, of food in the world, you don't have to, lick your plate, which, I caught him doing a couple times. And usually it was just ice cream, but, I guess we've all been sort of maybe guilty of that. But the reality is as I grow up and I have my kids and I have these kids that have my wife has done an amazing job of training them to stop eating when they're full, and like that is such a novel thing. And I sit there with my girls and I look at their plate and I go, you're gonna finish that? I'm like, she says, no, I'm full, I'm done. And then of course, what's the next thing you say? It's like, well, then you're not getting dessert. So it's like, wow. So now I've turned this cultural compulsion to finish your plate into some reward, some cuckoo reward system, for finishing, what's on your plate. And we've all experienced that at some level, haven't we? Like, so what I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about maybe, share some stories about your sort of families of origin, how you learned about food, how you learned about what it means in the family, both socially and medically, et cetera, and then talk about what it means to be full. And actually, the word is satiety, and this is by no means like a comprehensive lecture on this subject because it is broad, but it's kind of new also if you think about us as humans, because it's only in, I don't know, maybe the last 100 years or so that we've had so much food available to us. I I had the opportunity to travel and visit Kenya with and got out in the Maasai area with, and I was taking some kids with me. And one of the kids there was sort of portly, and me being me, I'm just sort of like kind of genetically this, thin guy, and I was leading the group. I was clearly the oldest one, but the people there were not interested in talking to me, and nor were they interested in asking me for anything, because they thought they didn't think I was the one with the money. They thought the young guy in our group who was heavy was the guy with the money, and because in that culture, if you have money, then you've got food, and if you've got food, you're going to be a little heavier than everybody. So that's an interesting sort of cultural sort of slap in the face that I got a little bit of when I got to travel in the world. But the bottom line is the idea of finishing your plate is a family is sort of from our families of origin, and it has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with the culture. Again, finishing our dinner seems to be related to getting a reward at the end of that, which is a dessert, which has its problems sometimes. And then the other one, it's guilt. There's the whole idea of like, you finish your food because, there's children starving in some, fill in the blank of some country. And the numbers of countries, where that is a reality is shrinking because of the availability of food, even in the world now. But in this country, it's overwhelming, the availability of food. So it's a culture of abundance. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the science of feeling full or feeling hungry, and introduce that idea to you, and then and then give you a couple of tidbits of other ideas of things that actually either stimulate hunger or stimulate satiety, or the non-feeling of hunger. So there's this idea of these hormones these hormones that circulate around in our bodies. And I have this picture. There it is. Oh, see, Joshua, are you the host?
Yeah, sorry, I just got booted out right now.
You did?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you need me to let you share screen?
Can you do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'll see. I mean, I'm new to this, but if it works, then I'll have a little visual.
Go for it.
So let's see here. Okay. So here is a nice schematic of the relationship between leptin and ghrelin. And I'll just say right now that right on this campus, we have one of the world experts in leptin, and his name is Dr. Ben Yaspelkus. And I think you should just ask him to give you a lecture on this, because I'll probably kill it. But I'll do the best that I can to describe leptin as it works in our body. And I'm not going to leave you high and dry, because sometimes when people learn about these hormones, they think it's no use. Like leptin is this driver of our satiety, and this one over here on the left side here called ghrelin is what suppresses appetite or stimulates appetite, and leptin suppresses appetite. And so when your stomach feels hungry, is empty, it can send a signal via the ghrelin neural hormone to the brain to say that you're hungry, that you feel hungry. And that's that feeling. It's not necessarily your stomach grumbling. It's actually a feeling in your brain to say that I am hungry. And once you fill the stomach, usually that stimulation goes away. And why does it go away? Because what happens in your fat cells, and they're shown in this schematic down here in the fat cells, we have fat cells all over your body. But when you actually do eat something, the fat cells, which are adipose cells or adipocytes, they produce this hormone called leptin. And that's over here, and it's the appetite suppressor. And that's very interesting because they work sort of like a balance. And leptin is the area of huge amounts of research because there's this idea that as people get obese, and the leptin receptors become become overstimulated, and there's this thing called leptin resistance. And the resistance is a problem, because if you don't get this signal to stop eating, then you just keep eating, even though you're not needing any more food, definitely, but you feel like you need more food. So it's brought this idea of obesity to this notion that it might be not just purely behavioral, but it might be disease. And so it puts obesity in this different sort of, I don't know, sort of level of consideration. Maybe a lot less judgment, for the people who are suffering from this problem. And I have to say, just getting to know like I said, I look at my own family, I look at my daughters, and one of them just eats, pushes the plate away, says she's finished. The other daughter will say, look at her plate and say, hey, you gonna finish that? I'll finish that for you, because she enjoys eating, and there's this sort of joy in eating. And again, there's that training of eating that becomes sort of a social thing. So a lot of people will grow up with all the social events being surrounded by eating. And so for this particular person in my own family, they just approach things really, really differently. But those are the hormones that we're talking about. And I have this other image here that leptin does a lot more in your body than just this one over here, which is regulate the appetite, control of metabolism, and energy homeostasis. It actually acts on the brain to decrease the appetite. But it has to do with with immune cells. It regulates blood pressure. Over here, the thyroid gland. We talked before about thyroid dysfunction being a contributor to metabolism and ultimately weight gain or loss. Over here, it talks about decreases glucose-stimulated insulin secretion. Therefore, it's related to someone's tendency to become diabetic, possibly. The leptin will actually increase the heart rate. It regulates bone mass down here in the corner, and also is involved in regulation of menstrual cycle. So this is a very, very interesting and very underknown or discussed hormone in our body. But it deserves a lot of attention. So when you look at the sort of the balance of, again, this is a bit of a review, but before you eat, the stomach will produce ghrelin, and that will go to stimulate hunger and eating. Some people from willpower can sort of work through that, and that stimulation will go away after a while, and that sort of stimulus to eat will be put off. And we'll talk about that in a second. Because remember last week we talked about fasting and the health effects of that. And I'll say a couple things about that in a bit. But the adipose tissue is a little bit of asleep at this time, so the fat in the is not necessarily putting out this leptin. After you're eating, just the opposite happens. It's a leptin-dominated system, and there's this movement towards satiety or eating enough. And the breakdown of the system is when the brain does not get the signals, does not interpret the signals from the leptin, and satiety is not experienced, and people can just keep eating without even being hungry necessarily. And so that's just a review of that system. Let me get out of this. Sorry about that. I'll leave that up for now. Okay, so what are some of the things? So when we talk about leptin, what are the things that if we want to stimulate either the production or the activity of leptin, what are some of the things that do that? And like I said, these are just a few things, but they're interesting. One of those I'll review. Remember last week we talked about the ketogenic diet? And so one thing that's known about the keto diet is that it does increase leptin production. So that's very interesting. So when you eat these more fatty driven meals, actually you'll get a more efficient production of leptin. So that's good, I think, for most of us. What about some other things? We talked also about intermittent fasting last time. And one interesting study, they looked at people of the Muslim faith who were celebrating or practicing Ramadan. And if you're not familiar with that, and during that period of the year, the people will not eat anything at sunup all the way to sundown. And what they found is that in that basically, study of intermittent fasting is basically what it is, that those people also experienced an increase in the leptin production from their fat cells. So that was quite interesting. What are some of the things like dietary that might affect leptin? Well, one of the things that's interesting is omega-3 fatty acids. And here we are, we're back to fat again. Like we talk a lot about fat in this program, don't we? Anyway, but in our diet, the omega-3 fatty acids, as you probably remember, there's omega-3s, omega-6s, and omega-9s. And omega-3s are the most prominent in some of the food or sort of the animal sources of the omega-3 fatty acids. And what is known about those, especially of the EPA type of the omega-3s, is that those have anti-inflammatory properties. And so what's quite interesting about the effect of leptin and maybe its efficiency in the brain is that it may be seated in this inflammatory or inflammation. So because it's well known that omega-3s will increase the activity of leptin, and it'll actually decrease the activity of the ghrelin. So omega-3s, so those are the fish oils basically. And if you ever talk to me in person, you'll know that I'm a big fan of the omega-3 fatty acids as part of not only our diet, but maybe as a supplement. If you ever decide to take omega-3 fatty acids, I always tell people that you have to find a really good company that produces these without and if they produce them, it's good to know where they get the fish and whether they submit their batches to third-party assessment, because there's a lot of mercury and a lot of other products that can find their way into fish oils. And so when I ask people to get those supplements, I only send them to some of the better companies, and we can talk about some of those companies later. But the important thing is to get high quality fish oils if you're going to take that as a supplement, and if you're going to eat fish, get high quality fish. And the main fish that I buy is wild caught ocean fish, and the smaller the fish, the better. The larger the fish, the longer the fat has had to absorb and to store up toxins. And mostly I'm talking about metals. So if you eat a big fish like a halibut or a shark or a tuna or those big giant fish, those have a higher mercury levels. The smaller fish, the Alaskan salmon, sardines are really small. Some of the fish oils that they make out of krill, which are those little tiny ones, little fish, those are very much safer. If you're going to the restaurant and you're ordering fish, don't let them fool you into selling you a piece of fish that's farm raised. And farm raised means like this. It's like they have a pond and they throw a bunch of antibiotics and a lot of pesticides that sort of run into this fish pond, and then they grow the fish and then they serve it to you, and that's gross. And one time, the food server was answering my question, and it was like a fish place, and they said, I won't say the name of it, but they said it's agricultured. It's like, what do you mean agriculture? It's like, oh, it's from the East. And I'm like, East what? And so like, basically it was just from a farm. So the bottom line is they'll try to talk around that reality, but in my opinion, you got to get wild caught fish. Smaller the better. If you love your big fish, halibut, have it once in a while, but I wouldn't make a habit of it. In my practice, I'm a little bit of a tangent here, but I'm trying to get you to buy good stuff. But in my practice, people are using these things for lots of reasons, not only for anti-inflammatory reasons, but for brain function reasons. So that's the DHA form of the omega-3 fatty acids, which may play a part in neural processing and the utility of leptin in the brain as well, but that's not as well worked out. So it seems like inflammation and the anti-inflammatory, what I call the anti-inflammatory diet, plays a part in the activity of leptin on the brain, or at least the efficiency of it. And why is that? There's other things that drive inflammation that also have effect on leptin and ghrelin levels, and one of those is just plain sugar. And so sugar will actually decrease the leptin levels and increase the ghrelin. So bottom line is, sugar is having this direct effect on your brain, maybe from some of the inflammatory pathways as well. And so sugar, once again, is a poison. And I started alluding to that last time we were together. And and I think it's not this time, but next time is going to be the big reveal of why sugar should be outlawed. They tried it in New York. Remember when who is it? Michael Bloomberg. He made big gulps illegal in the whole city of New York, and that didn't go over real well because it sort of impinged upon people's civil liberties. But he was just trying to do something that was a positive public health move. Again, very unpopular. Anyway, back to leptin and ghrelin and some of these things that affect appetite. So so now that you know all this science, what's how useful is it, and are there ways that you can like kind of drive or change your sort of tendencies toward satiety, or affect your appetite and your behaviors? And That's interesting. So we'll go back in time a little bit to back in the 60s, and back in the 60s and then maybe early 70s, people were just taking speed, uh, like, and these were the diet pills of the 60s, and sure enough, if you take a stimulant, amphetamines, you will greatly, profoundly decrease your appetite. And that may or may not have anything to do with the activity of leptin or ghrelin on the brain, but it will decrease your appetite. So those are being prescribed left and right to some people in the 60s. And they found that there were some sort of significant cardiac side effects, and people were overdoing it with some of these, some of these prescription medicines. And so the AMA decided we're not going to have this anymore, and the FDA said no, this is not appropriate use of these medicines. Very interestingly, in a little sidebar, these exact same medicine, dexedrine and then Ritalin, came out of that. So what we have now is a whole culture of kids who are taking stimulants for their attention, right? And same exact drugs as they were in the 60s, but they're lower doses. But if you know anybody who takes these medicines, especially in kids, if you're like, I have some people in my other practice, and the moms know that they have to give this medicine to the child after breakfast, because if they take it before breakfast, the child won't eat anything. And one of the things you have to watch when you have kids on these medicines, these stimulants for attention deficit disorder, are weight loss. And so it's very common for a human being that should be growing to be actually losing weight because they're on these medicines. So it severely decreases appetite. And you can only imagine how these medicines can be abused in things like eating disorders such as anorexia. And so these are dangerous drugs. They're very dangerous to the heart in some people. And so so they're not used. But as early as like the 90s, you might remember the fen-phen diet. And phentermine is one of the products, which is a stimulant. And that was also found to cause too many cardiac side effects in the people who were using it in the 90s. But that was a very effective way to decrease appetite. What else? Well, I'm a sports doctor, right? So, I'm involved in prescribing exercise. And like, as much as I try, sometimes people don't always buy it. And it's true in the attempt to actually exercise to lose weight, and all the exercise physiologists in the room can attest to this, is like the number of calories burned during that session of exercise are really not that impressive when it comes to the desire to actually decrease someone's body weight. And so exercise, lifting weights is part of the program, but that alone doesn't do it. If you've ever done a hard workout and you look at your iPhone or whatever you have, and it tells you like how many calories you burned. I've done it before, and I don't do it anymore because I just get, I don't know, it's not impressive to me because I worked really hard, and it says I burned enough calories like to equal one piece of pie or something like that. And it's like, that isn't very much. Like, dude, I was working hard. Look at all this sweat. What happened? So exercise alone in thinking of it that way isn't necessarily beneficial to weight loss, but there are things that exercise does on these systems that's important. As it does is it decreases the appetite, especially after the exercise. And there's this release of beta endorphins, and the endorphins, these endorphins actually give you a sense of well-being, and the well-being actually offsets the feeling of hungerness. And so the need or the desire for more food is actually decreased. So there's that neurologic benefit of exercise that's very real. And benefits of exercise are broad, as you all know. in the treatment of anxiety and depression. And you've probably had some lectures from some of our psychology experts, and they've talked about the role of depression and anxiety in the sort of the act of eating for comfort. And so once again, exercise is a treatment, is a bona fide treatment for depression. And it's been well studied and well known. It's better than most interventions for improving the symptoms of depression. Therefore, if people are less depressed, they tend less as behaviorally to go to the food to be sort of comforting. So exercise is on the list of activities to decrease this idea of appetite or achieve satiety. So, how are y'all doing? Are we still together? Nice. I thought I'd throw in a couple extra things about that affect our cravings, and cravings are a little different, aren't they? And I'll throw in one of my favorites, and it's called glutamates, and I'll maybe get out of this shared screen mode because I don't need to have you stare at leptin or ghrelin. I'll just leave it up there for now if you're all guys are okay. But there's this idea of glutamates and receptors in our brain, and things that are excitatory. What's the most common? I'll give you a second, Neil. What's the most famous synthetic glutamate that you can get at the grocery store? And give me 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, it's monosodium glutamate. You've all heard of MSG, right? So what is MSG? Well, MSG is a synthetic form of a glutamate that when it gets in your brain, it excites the brain. And it's very interesting. If you see the little balance of ghrelin and leptin in the brain, you can draw the exact same teeter-totter of glutamates and GABA. And GABA stands for GABA-aminobutyric acid. And that's actually inhibitory on the brain. And so certain things excite the brain, and certain things inhibit the brain activity, and they're always in this sort of balance going up and down like this. So when you overload the glutamate receptors, what you get is this excitatory response. And so one of the sayings that I share with my patients is this: it's like glutamate and MSG basically is the reason you can't eat just one Dorito. Somebody raise their hand who's ever had one Dorito and stopped eating Doritos. I don't see any hands. I think we're losing people. Maybe you need to eat some Doritos right now to keep this lecture going. But the bottom line is,
5.
you had 5?
Yes.
Congratulations.
You must have had the last 5 in the bag, is why.
Yes.
Exactly.
My kids ate them all.
Exactly. So you have to eat the whole bag, and they put those in there on purpose because those are, when you're eating a Dorito, you're just having pure excitatory response on the brain, and you just want more. You're not even hungry. You don't even think they taste good. And don't even start with Cheetos. Cheetos are the hot Cheetos. Those are amazing. Like, no, they're not. They're kind of gross, but I've had them before, and I just keep eating them. Like, I just stay over there and just keep eating them. So that's a synthetic effect on the brain that's excitatory, that gives you this pleasure, and you can't even describe it. One of the other things, but here's something that's interesting. There's lots of natural glutamates in foods, in organic foods, and a lot of the beans and legumes are actually very natural providers of these glutamates. And so one of the other sayings that I have in my practice is different brains are different. And some brains are very sensitive to these glutamates, and other brains kind of go a little bit bonkers when they're exposed to glutamates. And so I'll have moms come in talking about their child who has all this hyperactivity, and they'll go to Chipotle and have a perfect, burrito bowl with organic beans, dark beans, or what have you, and the kid will still be up all night because they're stimulated by that bolus of glutamates in the natural food. So it doesn't have to be Doritos, and that's where when we do diet, analysis for people with behavioral issues, it takes a lot of time because everybody's brain is different. And so, so that said, what are there's very interesting things that come out of neuroscience these days that have to do with the things that we put in our mouth. And so I'll finish. Well, I'm not quite finished, but there's another one that's really interesting. And I'm going to blow your minds with this one. And for this one, you got to really hang with me because it's describing gluten, and it's describing casein, which is one of the proteins in milk. All right. And I just want to take a break here and say, is my audio coming through? Because you guys are all jumping all over my screen like little robots. So if we're still sound good, I'll keep going. Okay, great. Thanks, Josh. Gluten has this new identity in the past 10 to 15 years in medicine, and there's actually a diagnosis now in medicine called gluten sensitivity, and the question is, we don't really know what it is, other than that when people eat gluten, they tend to get some negative symptoms. I think it might be a function of the GMO, the genetically modified organisms, which is the gluten that's mostly grown from the wheat in the United States. One thing that's very interesting is that the countries of Europe, namely Italy, who grows a lot of wheat, they do not allow the seeds from the genetically modified products to be grown in Italy yet. And there isn't much talk about this thing called gluten sensitivity. That's the only difference that I know. But what I found is that some people who don't digest these proteins very well have an interesting constellation of symptoms. And what I'm getting at is this. If you take gluten or casein, which is one of the many proteins in milk products, and it could be cow's milk, it could be goat's milk, all of those mammals have a certain level of casein in it as a protein. But first we have to understand what a protein is, right? Because we think of protein as like, I'm going to take protein and get all muscle bound, but proteins are what make the world go around. And a protein is nothing more than a chain of these things called amino acids. And again, I'm using a term that everybody's heard of, but maybe not so specifically familiar with. But the best way to describe a protein is that it's like a certain sequence of these amino acids that define what it is. For instance, my name is Ric Sletten, and it's spelled R-I-C-S-L-E-T-T-E-N, and that defines me. And if you take those letters and rearrange them into something else, you might get some other name like Nicolas Cage or something like that. But then you have a whole new person with a whole different set of letters that defines that person. And so Nicolas Cage and me are different proteins in a sense because of the way our letters are arranged. And so if you take this long sequence of these amino acids, you get something called gluten. And you take another long list of amino acids, you get something called casein. And the miracle of biochemistry is that we know what these sequences are. That's what's really cool about biochemistry, is we know what these sequences of amino acids are in all these proteins. And so, and when you eat these things, when you eat gluten and when you eat casein, and when you eat any protein, goes down into your stomach, and it's subjected to this very low pH, a very high acid. It starts breaking all these bonds between the letters or between the amino acids. And also these enzymes that come from your pancreas are responsible for breaking down these breaking down these bonds between all these amino acids. And then it sort of trickles into your intestinal tract, gets absorbed into your body as these amino acids, and your body puts the amino acids back together into the proteins that you need to be whatever your name is, so for example. And so that's the miracle of the engine that we have here, is that you can put anything in there as a fuel, and we'll break it down and then put it back together the way that we need it. And you know, I call it, I don't know if you know this, but I call it the Costco effect. And has anybody ever been to Costco? No? Stephen, you've never been to Costco. I don't believe it. Anyway, you've been to Costco, and whenever I go to Costco, you have to stand in line, right? So when you're standing in line, what do you do when you're standing in line at Costco? Well, what I do is I look and see what other people are buying. Don't you do that? You look around and you're like, oh, that guy owns a restaurant, or that guy has no control over what he buys because the kids are deciding what they buy, and you're looking over there. But what you're realizing is that what an amazing machine this is. Like, we can all buy all this this junk and put it in our bodies, and it'll run the engine. It'll run the engine pretty well. And so that's why I call it the Costco effect. But what's really interesting about gluten, and what's really interesting about casein, is that if you take this long protein, and if you don't break it down all to the individual amino acids, you have a small sequence in between. So if the protein's this long, and I don't do a good job of digesting this protein, there's a sequence in between that is actually the same sequence as morphine. Or remember, I talked about exercise and releasing these endorphins. These are protein sequences that actually give the brain some pleasure, right? If you've ever heard of morphine, if you've ever heard of these types of drugs that we use in medicine to help people take their pain away, sure enough, that sequence within the larger sequence of gluten and within the larger sequence of casein exist. And actually, these sequences can be measured in the urine, because some of these things make it all the way through into your body, into your bloodstream, and I can measure those in your urine. They're called gluteomorphines and casomorphines. And that's a very interesting, not very well-known lab that one can do it. We do it in more functional medicine than in traditional medicine. But it says something about these things that are getting into your body, affecting your brain. Ultimately, we pee them out. But what's interesting is these gluten molecules can turn into a morphine-like molecule. These casein molecules can turn into a morphine-like molecule. And here's the way that you remember this, guys. Have you ever had pizza? All right, raise your hand if you've ever had pizza.
Well, Asia's talking about the Costco pizza.
Oh yeah, $10.
It's good.
It's really good.
Any pizza.
It's cheap, super cheap. But let me say something about pizza. I don't know about you, but I can always have another piece of pizza. How about you?
Oh, yes.
Oh yeah.
I can always have more than two.
I can always have another piece. I have to decide, like, I'm going to stop eating pizza now. And the only reason I stop is because I know it's going to be delicious for breakfast, right? But the bottom line is, you have to decide to stop eating pizza. Why? Because you're absolutely high. You're absolutely high on these gluteomorphines and these casomorphines, because you've overtaxed your ability to break down these proteins all the way. So these morphines are getting into your bloodstream. And if you combine that with something like beer, like game over, right? So the reality is that's just another form of food which affects your eating behavior, right? And so that's it's kind of a talk that's come full circle, starting with this idea of satiety, because when you're eating that pizza and you can have another piece, like there's no leptin that's going to stop you from doing that. You just are just enjoying it so much because the endorphin level, that sort of that morphine level in your brain is so high, you just can have another piece. So you have to intellectually decide to stop eating that pizza. So there's a lot working against us for satiety, isn't there? In this culture of abundance, right? And there's just so much food available to us, and not only just generally, but like all day. And that's the hard part. If you have kids, or if you're thinking about that, I'm like I said, I bring up my kids sometimes. It's like the whole school situation is completely out of hand when it comes to eating and parties, right? Because it used to be, like when I was in school, you'd have a party, maybe you'd have like a Valentine's Day party, and some room mom would bring a few cupcakes. But we've got situations now where people are bringing in cupcakes for every week for the whole class, 3 cupcakes a kid for every kid who ever has a birthday. So there's like parties every single week with this amazing amounts of foods. And this is what we're sort of equating to love, isn't it? Like, well, I love you so much. Here's some cupcakes, and let's do this every week. So clearly, for those of us who are looking outside in, it's a bit out of hand because we don't have the mechanism to push that plate away and say, no, I'm not going to have that. It's not what I need right now. So that's just a really quick run through of the history of and some of the science of satiety. Like I said, we could go on forever about this subject, but I thought I'd introduce it to you. Did you have a question, Stephen, or did you put your hand up?
Can't hear you.
I can't hear you. Fix your mic. I lost him. He just said goodbye. I think he said goodbye. Okay. Any questions? Any ideas? Any sort of experiences with this, or anywhere? Anything that I can? Yeah, Jenny.
Hi, I came in 30 minutes late. I do have a question about gluten sensitivity and how that could possibly relate to gut health.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great subject. And gluten sensitivity, like what I said about gluten sensitivity, one is that it's a new diagnosis. Mm-hmm. It has no test. There is no diagnostic test for gluten sensitivity. There's no. It's a constellation of symptoms that have to do with GI upset. Mm. And can be a lot of other things. Headaches, skin findings can be related to gluten sensitivity. It's not an allergy because there's no, specific allergy and responses that we can measure, and it's not even necessarily a sensitivity. And what I say by that is that what we're trying to do sometimes in functional medicine is doing different types of antibody tests to food. And what we sometimes get in people who have a clinical gluten sensitivity is an IgG positive test to gluten. And without going into more detail, the IgE molecule, which is immunoglobulin, which is an antibody, is specific to allergy. And then the immunoglobulin G, or IgG antibody, is more what we call sensitivity. But some people can have high IgG antibodies to gluten and not have these symptoms. So it's not a slam dunk when you get that test. So there is no test for sensitivity. But what's going on in the GI tract with gluten sensitivity is anybody's guess, because what it seems like is going on there's this abnormal motility response to certain foods. And so what that will be related to is this idea of not only abnormal motility, meaning things go through too quickly, but there's sort of a spasm related to sensitivity to certain foods. And that's just a hit and miss thing. Some people find out what it is in the way of a trigger, because what I'm describing is irritable bowel syndrome, right? And irritable bowel is another sort of, maybe a better word for irritable bowel is like spastic colon syndrome, because what's really going on is food and gas is trying to move through the gut, and it kind of gets trapped for a little while, causing some pain. And then usually the thing that lets it loose is the passing of a little gas. So if things are going through like the transverse colon right over my stomach right here, and I get a block here and a block here, I get pain. It hurts a lot. It hurts a really lot. And then what people will usually tell me is like if they pass gas or if they have a bowel movement, which is letting that go, that will relieve some of their symptoms. But it's that spasm of the smooth muscle of the colon that's probably related. It has to do with motility. And that's another great lecture. I have a lecture I'll happy to give to you. It's called The Gut-Brain Connection. And have you seen it? Oh. Anyway, I've given it a couple times on campus, so I'll be happy to give it to you. But it's a really, really interesting look at gut motility and where serotonin comes from and how that works with the microbiome. The microbiome is the new star of the 20s of the 2000s. Everybody's into what's the right bacteria to have in your gut, and the gluten sensitivity might be a player in that, but I'm not exactly sure. But it's a very vague diagnosis, but it is a diagnosis now that has a code and everything. Yeah, anybody else?
My short, you can hear me now? Okay, so my hopefully short answer is, so with the pizza, so is there anything that we can consume that would effectively break that protein down?
Well, there's some, they say that some of the fruits, like the pineapple and the what was the other one? Somebody help me out. Your nutrition people. There's pineapple.
Papaya. Is it papaya?
Thank you. Yeah, Jasmine. Papaya. That was but those aren't necessarily known to be have very good protease activity. And what we're looking for is enzymes that actually help break down protein bonds. Right. Those ones are really good for breaking down carbohydrates, etc. As far as I know. So for people who are trying to work on that, there are some digestive enzymes that can be taken with meals that help your system break down the proteins. But also the bacteria in your gut are actually responsible for further breakdown of proteins before these molecules have a chance to be absorbed into the body. And there's two pathways that work there at the gut. One of them is some of the enzymes that the bacteria make, and the role of the bacteria at having healthy tight junctions. And what I mean by that is, in the gastroenterology terms, you have to get food absorbed through a cell that lines your intestine, and then that cell is what is a barrier between your intestine running by here, and on the other side is the blood vessel, and something has to get through the cell to the blood vessel. But there's these junctions between each cells that actually things can slip in between, and those tight junctions are actually what we call leaky gut. And when people have some leaky gut, which is a function of microbiome health in some levels, in some ways, then some of these proteins could get absorbed into the blood supply before they even have to get into that enterocyte, that cell along the GI tract. So that's just a little gastroenterology for you, but it's this microbiome that is becoming a huge player in how well we break things down and how efficiently or we absorb some things, either too soon or not at all.
I was just trying to see if there was something I could eat with the pizza that, you know, would make eating the pizza okay, but I guess not.
No
Well,
cheating, Dr. Loy.
Yeah, I was gonna say you could go with the Hawaiian, you know.
But Canadian bacon and pineapple pizza, maybe it might work, right? But
all
that's not good pizza though.
Well, you know, okay. So, how many people do we have here? Okay, we can gang up on Stephen Lloyd tonight.
Yeah.
But I think that eating pizza again, it's like most people have the mechanism for breaking all that down. But if you eat it really fast, maybe you don't, right? It's because it gets into your stomach and it has to churn around, it has to be broken down. But you know, I'm on my third piece by the time, you know, I think about it because it's just so darn good, right? And so that's
Slow
the
down.
and that's part of the function. You know, we'll talk next time about, you know, dopamine, and that's, you know, like I said last time I started to talk about dopamine. I'm going to finish today starting to talk about dopamine again in the brain. It's like there's so much involved with the reward mechanisms of our brain and food. It's so complicated, but it's wildly interesting. And like I said, I think I don't remember what my subject is next time, but next time I want to talk more about dopamine and food and what we can, you know, what we can do. And it's radical, but it's simple. But I'll leave you at that. But we got a question down here, Jasmine.
Yes, I have a question about what are your thoughts on probiotics? Because, I mean, it's claimed that probiotics have the healthy bacteria and all of that. And my sister-in-law, she's like obsessed with giving my nieces a probiotic every single day. So I don't know whether I should do it. My son, he complains of stomach issues quite a bit, but I always tell him it's all the sugar you're eating. So I don't know if I should give him a probiotic daily or no.
Okay, that is a great question. And like whoever's telling them to not eat so much sugar that's the first thing, right? Because sugar is, I mean, by next time I'm going to convince you guys that sugar is poison. It is poison, and it's killing us, and it's killing us slowly, but it's killing us. And so we need to get off of sugar. So that's number one for kids. Number two, there's some very good studies on probiotics. And by the way, you're talking to a probiotic fan. All right. So, and like I said, I'll give you guys my lecture on just the gut-brain connection. But if you look at some of the studies, I'll just take a study on kids since your question was about kids. The Journal of Pediatrics, which is the journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is the Pediatrician's Journal, put out a study, 2013-14, that said children who take probiotics have less cold and flu. Period. They didn't even say like which probiotics they were. They just said children who take probiotics, and they controlled for all of those some of the other variables. But they said, period, they have less cold and flu. Why is that? Because, you know, as we are coming to understand in sort of the general population, I think the general population is hearing this more than the medical sort of community, and that is that 80% of our immune system resides along our intestinal tract. 80%. All those little Peyer's patches, all those little those immune bundles are actually tied to our intestinal tract, and so that's number one for immune health is in a healthy microbiome is what they're talking about. And so what you're trying to achieve is a healthy microbiome that and thus have a healthy immune status. And when you have a healthy immune status, all the other things fall into place, especially when it comes to inflammation. And inflammation is king when it comes to disease processes in general. But what we're trying to do is decrease the sugar. And why is that? I'll just stay in the gut for you with the sugar thing, okay? The sugar thing feeds yeast, And what we know about yeast is mostly it's in functional medicine stuff, but we have a nice balance of bacteria. We have a nice balance of other organisms in our intestinal tract. We're supposed to have some yeast organisms and species in our gut. Candida is one of those, but there's thousands of other yeast species, but they're not supposed to be overgrown. And we know that sugar is a food for yeast. And so when we call something sort of yeast overgrowth, that can affect immune function and overall gut function in general. So once again, sugar feeds that yeast, and it can overgrow because in your intestinal tract, there's a constant competition for space. Like there's constant competition for sort of seats on the deck of the boat, right? And so your job is to encourage that positive balance of the bacteria that actually help us and don't, or the organisms that don't help us. And so that brings me to the idea of cravings, and how cravings may be partially driven by yeast in the intestinal tract. We've been having COVID lately. So has anybody made some sourdough bread at home yet? We did. You haven't done it? Well, that means you don't have any friends.
I don't eat bread.
You're supposed to get your friend to give you some starter, right? So we got some. We made a couple loaves, and then our starter died because we just dropped the ball. But man, it was amazingly good, like the sourdough bread. And I don't know about you, but like bread is really good. Do you think? And like how do we deal with that? Well, it's possible. Some people in functional medicine say that statement that I just gave you is like bread is really good. It basically because it's a carbohydrate. It's feeding the yeast in our gut, and our gut is producing some biomarkers that actually get into our blood that are affecting the brain and affecting these cravings to get you to eat more of that so it can feed itself and thus grow. And that sounds crazy, but it's not so crazy. And there are some organic acids, which are what these things are called, these byproducts of yeast metabolism, of bacteria metabolism. And these things can be analyzed in your urine now because they're put off by the bacteria in your gut. Humans don't make these organic acids, so they can be measured in your urine, and you can get a relative amount of these byproducts, these organic acids, from yeast. And if they're higher than the population average, you can say, wow, I'm yeasty. And so you can work on getting the yeast down in your body. There's actually some probiotics that are quite good that are specifically for that. And they're actually, there's yeast that actually kill yeast. And one of those you might have seen on the shelves is called Saccharomyces Boulardii. Has anybody seen that one yet? It's one of those ones that doesn't have to be refrigerated. But Saccharomyces Boulardii is actually a yeast that knows where it is. It does not colonize the human gut. And it comes through and actually kills other yeast species. Isn't that interesting? So these microbes actually know where they are. They know they're not where they like to be. So they don't even colonize the human gut. That's fascinating. So these microbes have been spending a lot of time knowing where they want to be, and bacteria know where they want to be. And what we have now are things called human fecal transplants. And what is going on is there's some people who just have some really good poop, and it's so good. The microbiome is such a nice balance that they're actually taking that and put it into people who have these intestinal problems, such as the irritable bowel, that's intractable irritable bowel, and trying to encourage it to grow there. It's very tricky because most bacteria in your gut have colonized your gut and have moved in and colonized most of your intestinal tract by the time you're about 3 years old. So changing those colonies is very, very tricky. And that's, you know, that's a fun little talk to give at some other time. But the idea of probiotics is a huge industry right now. There's no real regulation of it at the FDA. There's a lot of talk about it. So when one decides to take some probiotics, again, you have to find a company that's responsible for ensuring that those are the bacteria that are actually in that capsule, and that those bacteria are actually alive when you get the capsule. One of my little rules of thumb when people want to take some probiotics is that if you go to the store and you read the label and if it says at the time of bottling, there's 5 billion organisms, that's not the bottle that you want to buy, because those bacteria might be dead. Most of the time, it'll say the company will actually ship the product cold. It'll be in the refrigerated area of the store. I pretty much trust, you know, Whole Foods for picking good companies that sell probiotics. But most probiotics need to be refrigerated. The company that I use in my practice actually ships the bottle cold. That's their standard. And they actually seal the bottle with nitrogen gas when they ship it. So when you get it, there's no oxygen surrounding those capsules, at least for that amount of time from the time you open it. And the reason for that is there's these anaerobic bacteria that are really important that like don't like oxygen. So they go to the extremes to make sure that those are sealed with nitrogen on their transit. So like I said, there's we've talked about two things today that are really near and dear to me, which is omega-3 fatty acids and probiotics. So when I talk to people about, you know, buying these supplements, if they choose to do it, I usually tell them those are the two supplements where you have to spend some money on a good company. I can't vouch for anything at like Target or Rite Aid or CVS. You know, I think that Costco tries to get good products, but theirs isn't necessarily refrigerated. Usually you have to go to Whole Foods to get a good company. And I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to, you know what those are. But yeah, probiotics are, but you know, I'm into cultured foods, but I'm not into those kombucha things. And I'll tell you why. It's too expensive. Like one bottle is like $4. That's like one bottle. And you drink it, it's gone. It's like you can buy a whole bottle of probiotics with, you know, 20 billion organisms in a capsule, you know, and get 90 capsules for, you know, $35, you know, and that'll last you. So, you know, drink some Kool-Aid and take a probiotic capsule, and, you know, you'll get the same thing. That's a nice face. But I think that eating cultured foods is a lot to ask people. You know, not everybody has a taste for sauerkraut. You know, I got some German heritage, so you know, I've had a kraut dog before with a little mustard, but you know, I wouldn't ask that of anybody. Yogurt obviously is a very, very viable cultured food. What I tell people about yogurt is that a good, you know, non-sugared, I tell people to eat non-sugared Greek yogurt has a good bacteria count. And just to remember a number, about 1 cup of good Greek yogurt will have about 1 billion organisms. If you just put that in your brain, 1 billion, 1 cup of good Greek yogurt. Excellent food. I recommend it to all people. But once again, you know, you can take a capsule with 20 billion organisms in 1 capsule. So when you're treating something, you have to go with higher doses. And you know, a lot of the companies that make claims about gut health in you know, on commercials, the reason they can make those claims, like what's that company? Somebody remind me of that company that sells it. Yakult, is that it? Yeah, Yakult. Yakult did the studies. They spent the money to show that it helps with irritable bowel, and so that's the only reason they can make that claim on television. Otherwise, they wouldn't be allowed to make that claim. So, but their yogurt isn't all that special. It's just that they did the work to do the study. Other yogurts are just as beneficial to irritable bowel. So when I treat people with irritable bowel, and if they don't have any dairy sensitivity, And there's other there's other yogurts that are non-dairy, but if they don't have dairy sensitivity that sets off their irritable bowel, then I'll put them on some yogurt if I can. So that's good. That's a long answer to your probiotic question. Look, you're already in your house. You've been driving.
But it's okay. But it's okay. I just didn't know if it was the same rule for adults. My mother-in-law has IBS, and sometimes when she gets really, really bloated, she can't exercise because it's so painful.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's an issue, gas is, the bloating is a function of digestion. And one of the truths about getting older is that we don't digest food as well. So we tend to produce more gas. And that's very interesting because it, for all of you who are students and are studying things, like the things that you study really come full circle, but when I was an undergraduate, I did research on rats, and we studied something called the unstirred water layer. It was a gastroenterology research, and it actually got me, a paper, and probably got me into a good medical school because I got to write on the subject. But the intestinal tract, if you kind of think of the intestinal tract, it's kind of like a river. And if you ever seen a river, it's like it flows really fast in the center, and then it slows down toward the shore, doesn't it? And then there isn't quite as much sort of flow at the shore. So if you think about absorption of nutrients, it's at that shore where things get absorbed into your body, isn't it? And so one thing that's true, there's something called the unstirred water layer at the shore, basically. And the thickness of that is, like if you have this wide of a river, and the water's running fast in the middle, and then as you get to the shore, it's not circulating at all. And there's actually an unstirred water layer there where there's no circulation whatsoever. And what's interesting about that in aging is we were doing studies on aging in the GI tract and absorption of nutrients. And it seems that that layer actually gets thinner. That layer over here gets thinner and thinner as you get older. And so what happens is there's probably less of an opportunity for food to get digested, and it just gets either absorbed too quickly, or at least incompletely. And so so that's an interesting sort of sidebar to aging, and like a mom who has more problems with gas, because gas is a problem for a lot of older people. But gas and irritable bowel in younger people is more of a function of motility and digestion, most likely, and maybe some food sensitivities. And of course, you always have to look into some of the more basic foods that produce more gas, etc. All right, anything else?
Time to go eat pizza.
Oh my gosh, I went over. Can't believe I talked for an hour. I was like, maybe I got 15 minutes of material here. Listen, good to see you all. I don't know if next time is my dopamine time, but that's going to be my last one, because it's just going to blow your minds. If this didn't already today, right?
Thanks,
Anyway,
Rick.
Thank you so
guys.
much, Dr. Sletten.
Be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good
Bye.
evening, everybody.